Hello, everyone. Welcome to Creation Questions. My name is Wesley Coleman, and today we're going to be talking about arguments for the existence of God. My statement here is that there are good arguments for God. And so if you disagree, you're welcome to join the stream and discuss them with me. This is going to be the third of the live streams in which I've discussed arguments for the existence of God. The last one was specifically about the Kalam, but it broadened up over the course of a 3-hour discussion. So if anyone is interested, feel free to join. I'm going to go over some of the arguments for God that I have presented in the past. All right. So the first one we've been talking about in pretty great detail is the Kalam cosmological argument. The Kalam cosmological argument was the term Kalam was coined by William Lane Craig based on the fact that Muslims of the sort of Middle Ages, of the sort of golden age of Islamic thought, posited this argument. So this version is sort of a inspired by that school of thought. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Then the conclusion follows that the universe must have a cause, and that would be God. A lot of skeptics are going to argue that the conclusion of the Kalam doesn't follow, the reason being that premise 2, that the universe didn't begin to exist because there is perhaps evidence of sort of like either an infinite chain of big bangs or some sort of substratum of the universe, like a quantum fluctuation, a quantum vacuum. They'll argue that premise 1 is false because everything that begins to exist is in part supported by our inferential knowledge of things that begin to exist within time and space and already are composed of material. Hey, Rebecca. How you doing? Thanks for joining. They'll also, let me see, where was I? They'll also argue that because the universe has a cause doesn't necessarily mean that it's God. That it could be, as it's a similar rebuttal to people who rebut premise 1, that it's some sort of substratum of the universe, some sort of like quantum field that is eternal. However, as we've discussed previously, the cause of the universe must have properties such as those that are sufficient to create the universe. Therefore, it has to be spaceless, timeless, immaterial. It also, and we've not discussed this part in as much detail, but it also needs agency. It needs to be intelligent. It needs to have a sufficient amount of strength, a sufficient amount of all capabilities which universe creation entails. And you could argue that there are even moral implications there, because there is a moral reality to the universe. You could argue that logic is there because the universe entails logical truths as well. So let's move on. So I added a new slide just so we could look at what is the support for premise 2, because a lot of people think that it's just this sort of inferential case based on our sort of scientific observation, but I think there's a lot more than that. So, like I've mentioned before, like the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, this is sort of the I guess sometimes it's called the boundary theorem. And what it is it's a scientific theorem, a mathematical theorem that states in any given expanding universe, there must be a finite point in which that universe began. So this is a scientific theorem. You can look it up. The second point is sort of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. Basically, we observe that the universe is increasing in entropy. It's going to a state of heat death, is what it's sometimes called. This is a state where free energy is turned into dead energy. Essentially, the material of the universe is no longer useful, no longer ordered. And then we do observe that the Big Bang Theory and the cosmic microwave background, the CMB, demonstrates that the universe, well, it's definitely had a finite point of its beginning, because if the universe is expanding, we should expect that there's basically a singularity, or point of time in which there can be, it can't be any more compact, and people often refer to this as a singularity. Finally, there's the impossibility of an actual infinite. And so this is the philosophical cases like Apollo. What is it? Apollo and the Rabbit? Oh, interesting. You don't think the universe is expanding, and that's fine, because I mean, we some people interpret redshift to be the stretching of light reaching to us. Rather, is that sort of your view? Either way, regardless, we still have to deal with the logical impossibilities of actual infinites. We still have to deal with thermodynamics. We still have to deal with other fields of knowledge. Yes. Okay. Yay. Hi, Mr. Green. Good to see you. Here, okay. So now we're moving on to the fine-tuning argument. Here, I'm gonna bring this back like that. So we didn't really get into the fine-tuning argument the last couple of streams, but I've I just wish William Lane Craig wouldn't base it on the Big Bang. Yeah, I think the reason why he does that is because it kind of sets the atheists up against their own system, their own cosmology. I think he also believes in the Big Bang, but I think if you believe the Big Bang, it just makes the cosmological argument a lot stronger on a scientific or like an inferential basis. But I understand that criticism. I think it's also a little bit confusing because the first premise, if we're going back to the Kalam, everything that begins to exist has a cause. You can divide that up into the two categories of things that are made up of material that already pre-existed, and they're just changing their form, they're changing their structure, and so they begin to exist in a sense. You could argue, in some case, you could argue that if you're a reductionist, if you're a materialist, that's a more nominalist sense, that the components are not de novo, they're not new, they weren't created ex nihilo, whereas the beginning of the universe would have needed to have something that could create matter from nothing. And so by using this inferential data within the universe, for instance, Big Bang cosmology, he kind of sets himself up a little bit for a mistaken criticism, which is that, everything that begins to exist has a cause only within the confines of the universe itself. And so therefore the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't have grounds in reality, whereas it's based on scientific laws, it's based on scientific theorems, and it's based on logical philosophical principles. So it's a larger, more encompassing metaphysical claim. Getting back to the fine-tuning, basic structure of a fine-tuning argument could be premise 1, the fine-tuner of the universe. The fine-tuning of the universe is due either to physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance. Conclusion, therefore, it is due to design. So we're doing this sort of process of elimination, basically. So here are some supporting supporting factors here. We have anthropic constants. So approximately 30 to 50 fundamental physical constraints, including gravity and electromagnetic forces, are exquisitely fine-tuned. Slight variations would prevent star formation, atom stability, or cause immediate universal collapse. Then we have the low entropy condition. This is something that Roger Penrose brings up. He calculated the odds of the universe's initial low entropy state occurring by chance. And that is 1, and the chances of that are 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power, which is a number impossibly large to write, obviously. That's just insane. And then the cosmological constant is another point of evidence. It's basically governing the cosmic expansion, and its value is fine-tuned to about 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, and then another point is that a larger value would prevent galaxy formation. A smaller one would cause collapse. So this is this basically any slight variation is going to end up totally annihilating the entire universe and everything in it. Then there's the strong nuclear force, which is a binding force. If it was 2% smaller, all hydrogen would be consumed, leaving no stellar fuel. If 5% weaker, no elements heavier than hydrogen could form, preventing life and chemistry. And then finally, carbon resonance, sometimes called Hoyle state. And this is carbon production in stars requires a highly specific triple alpha process. The precise energy levels for this led astronomer Fred Hoyle to suggest a, quote, super intellect has monkeyed with physics. You hear Stephen Meyer bring up that quote a lot. It's one of his pretty frequently used ones. Merry Christmas, Rebecca and Mr. Green. I hope you guys had a good holiday. Hoyle was a strange cat. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know much about him personally. Yeah, okay. Another argument that we've talked about, the moral argument. Now I'm just going to kind of like run through these ones pretty quickly. But if anyone has any objections or wants to come up and discuss one of the arguments for God, they're totally welcome. So, premise one, if objective moral values exist, an objective moral lawgiver exists. Pausing for a moment. Merry Christmas to you too. Should we call you by the channel name, or do you go by your first name? Or it doesn't really matter to me. You can just call me Wesley. I don't care. I'm not running anonymous, so creation questions, you can call me that too. CQ. I don't know about that. So yeah. We'd say that objective moral values exist, and we say that that's fairly intuitive, and it's universal across many different cultures. And I mean, that leads to the conclusion that a moral lawgiver exists, because if moral values exist just in the ether, and we're asking like, where do moral laws come from? Like, if they are objective, what grounds them? They have to be grounded in some kind of entity that's transcendent of moral truths. It's similar to arguments for God from other a priori, but this one is particularly focused on the moral aspect, which is in itself they're sort of synthetical a priori judgments, i.e. they're sort of constructs that exist within your mind. They're also true regardless of whether you believe that they're true. So, I mean, what we would argue is that someone who has no feeling, or some sort of like, I don't know if it's correct to say, is it psychopathic or sociopathic or something like that? But someone who doesn't have any sympathetic or sort of like emotive responses towards other people, or doesn't like register to them to feeling. Some people like that, they might not have then again, it's questionable, but they might not have the innate feeling of moral, like objective moral values, but we would still say that they would be wrong in, for instance, murder. Like, they're not exempt from this rule. And even if they don't have any sense that this objective truth is true, we still want to hold them to that. And I think, I know many have come to with conditions like that, similar to that, have come to conclusions that, in fact, objective moral values do exist. And for instance, you could point to like, remind me of his name. Like, is that Apologetics Channel X? What is it? Is that? Oh, I think he goes now by like Apologetics Roadshow or something like that. But like Acts 17 Apologetics. He has a really powerful testimony. I recommend. I'll link it down below after the stream. I recommend that you watch it if you haven't seen it. Yeah, moving on. So this is the sort of intelligent design argument, and there are many variations of this. Again, Stephen Meyer, he brings up the syllogism. All codes basically require a mind. DNA is a code, therefore DNA requires a mind. So broadening that up, that's sort of like, you can say which things require a mind: things with form, things with function, things with information. In his book on meaning, I believe it is, Polanyi talks about how, for instance, form and function and information, they all require more than just their material constituents. Then he asks the question, like, if you have some sort of tool, like take a smartphone or take a watch or whatever, you put it basically you put it in a box, you send it off to some chemist, and you tell them, you can look at all the chemical components of this. You can even look at how these chemical components are connected in relation to one another. What about any given configuration of these things tells you that it's functioning? What about them tells you that there's information there? And and form. All these things are contingent on the determination, the judgment of a mind. Also, the input of them requires a mind. Just like language, how any given word theoretically could just have any meaning that you kind of imbue upon it. It's entirely based on the agreed rules that as sort of a community, however big or small, has decided. And that's because information is not inherent. It's not inherent in the ink. It's not inherent in sort of like the electrical signals or electrical pulses of a computer. It's not inherent in the vibrations that get sent to your ear. These are all physical mediums in which, if we really closely examine the information in them, we see that it's external to the system. So this argument goes: all systems which have form, function, and information require an intelligent designer. Premise 2, biological systems have form, function, and information. And then conclusion: therefore, biological systems require an intelligent designer, i.e. God. Why does it have to be God? It's going to be for reasons similar to the contingency argument, which is we need something that is sufficient for the existence of this information, this biological information. And you could posit aliens exist, but that actually just pushes back the question, because then you have to ask, where did that biological information, where did that come about? Where did the information for them come about? So unless you're willing to just undergo this vicious sort of theoretical cycle of how information can come about in a naturalistic sense, where your explanation is never natural, then you have to see that information comes from a mind, form comes from a mind, function comes from a mind, and these things are totally contingent on a mind. Like, for instance, does a chair exist if there's no one there to observe that chair or to think about that chair? And that gets a little bit into what existence is. But if we're just looking at things from a totally materialist reductionist stance, and we see something like a chair, what are the things that make one chair, like for instance a sofa, similar to another chair, like a stool, or like a metal stool, or a lawn chair that's totally plastic? They're not made of the same components. They're not organized in similar ways, really. But their form and their function and their information, they're all comprised for the ends of being a place where you can sit down, basically. So if we don't exist, if there's nothing holding this category of items together, then can you really say that a chair exists? Right? Maybe not. So what? All this being said, basically, what you need is a mind that's sufficient to hold the existence of information, and that kind of goes into the contingency argument. But that's going to require a God. That's going to require a mind that's omniscient and omnipresent and omnipotent, all powerful, right? Ontological argument. If it is possible that the greatest conceivable being exists, so now this argument kind of has, it's sort of like backloaded into it, this idea of Anselm's greatest conceivable being. Yeah, I believe it's the Anselm's ontological argument that this is running with, and this is sort of a contemporary syllogistic version. But basically, Anselm is saying, you can think of, like, even the skeptic, right, can think of this idea of God, or like the greatest conceivable being, a being that there can be no greater than, a being with every attribute like ramped up to the max. And so, yeah, I can think of a being like that, right? So Anselm's idea is like, well, if you can think of about like a being like that, well, then you can think of it existing in some kind of world, right? In some possible world, you can think of it existing. And sure, that's possible, right? And then if you can think of this being existing in some possible world, then it is by its nature, right? What is the greatest conceivable being is something that you can conceive of that is real. And so if it's possible to exist in one world, it ought to, right? Because the greatest conceivable being would be less than the greatest conceivable being if it didn't. Therefore, this follows that if it's possible that a greatest conceivable being exists in some possible world, then that greatest conceivable being exists in every possible world. Premise 2, it is possible that the greatest conceivable being exists in some possible world. Therefore, the greatest conceivable being, i.e. God, exists in every possible world. Okay. And then another argument. This is a argument from a priori truths. Premise 1, if a priori truths exist, they must exist in some mind, either contingent or non-contingent. Premise 2, a priori truths exist outside all contingent minds. So what does that mean? Basically, and we've kind of gone over this, but a priori is a priori is how it's pronounced usually. But a priori truths are truths that cannot be discovered empirically, right? They're things also that you have to assume. They're sort of like, some people use presuppositional arguments, and they'll talk about a priori truths. They're things that you have to assume before you do things like science. Before you investigate the world in the empirical sense, you need the tools. So what do you need? You need like laws of causality. You need laws of identity. You need laws of non-contradiction. You need things to be coherent before you can conceive of coherent things external to yourself. And so basically an a priori truth is all these things that you need prior to looking at the external world. So if a priori truths exist, if these things exist that are necessitated for the existence of the external world to be coherent, to be legible, then they must exist in some mind, either contingent or non-contingent. And are these a priori truths contingent on your mind, or are they contingent on my mind? Because, I mean, they were true before you were born. Like 2 + 2 = 4 before you're born. The law of non-contradiction, or the sort of like the concept of identity, the concept of cause and effect, they're all true before you're born. And they're also true whether you agree on them, or whether you agree with them, or you agree or you don't. They're true. So they can't be contingent on your mind. So there must be some sort of non-contingent mind in which they exist. So a priori truths exist outside all contingent minds. And that's just known through our own observation. They don't exist in our mind. Conclusion, therefore, a priori truths exist in a non-contingent mind. And we would call that mind God. So we have an argument from agency. If naturalism is true, all human actions are the result of physical laws and prior physical states. So basically, you have the causal chain in a naturalist view of things starting out in a sort of state of a Big Bang, which creates all this hydrogen or helium and all the light elements, and eventually it sort of like gravity pulls it in and creates stars, and these stars create more heavy elements, and you have galaxy formation, and you have sort of the formation of the Earth and the Moon, and then you have abiogenesis, and then you have sort of like evolutionary processes that take these first populations of life and bring out the diversity of life and the complexity of life. So these are sort of like that's sort of like the overarching picture of naturalism. And if all those things are true, all human actions are the results of physical laws and prior physical states. So all things are reducible. They're all sort of, whether or not you want to say material. Material can also allow for emergent things, like maybe consciousness is emergent under a naturalist view, but you still have to reduce everything to physical laws, prior physical states. Premise 2, if human beings possess true agency, that is, the ability to initiate actions freely and intentionally, if they have essentially like any kind of free will, if they have any kind of ability to make decisions on their own and not because of every other prior state that's existed necessitating their state of decision. Basically, the argument here is in premise 2 that we observe and we also treat people like free will exists, like they have agency, like they can enact change. If you don't, you're kind of going against a consensus view that's not only a consensus view, but it's hard to live your life in a way which contradicts premise 2. So if you're going to argue against premise 2, you need to have, what does Carl Sagan say? It says, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So you're going to need extraordinary evidence. Conclusion, therefore, naturalism is false, and there must exist a transcendent source of agency. So not only does this disprove naturalism, if this is true, but it also requires there to be a higher state of and a source of agency. There needs to be an agent which gives agency. And it can't be something within just the material reductionist world, this nominalist naturalist world. We have another argument, the argument from desire. This is, again, it's sort of pulled out of, adapted by me a little bit, but it's pulled out of C.S. Lewis's own writings. I think probably Mere Christianity, you will find it. Probably some other places, but basically premise 1, every natural innate desire in us corresponds to some real object that can satisfy that desire. Premise 2, there exists in us a desire which nothing in time, nothing on earth, and no creature can satisfy. Conclusion, therefore, there must exist something more than time, earth, and creatures. This one's pretty straightforward. I think the only way I've heard this be contested is, well, we can explain why or where desires come from. Like we can explain why we're hungry. So it doesn't actually defeat this argument to explain, for instance, why we have desires for this sort of this higher state of meaning, or this sort of telos, or this sort of infinite interestedness or eternal joy that we all look for. It doesn't discredit it to say, well, we know where that comes from biologically or materialistically. We know what components in the brain or what kind of like hormonal states, or we know what kind of biological states, systems require that conclusion that we have this desire. Like, because we have the desire, it doesn't negate the argument that because we have the desire, there is something that can satisfy that. Because in all our experiences of things that we have desire of, there are things that satisfy them. I hope that made sense. The argument from contingency. So I've mentioned this a little bit earlier when I was talking about the moral argument mostly. But basically, anything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either intrinsically or extrinsically. The universe does not have to exist by its own nature. It exists extrinsically. Therefore, the universe must have an extrinsic explanation. Basically, this is sort of like, it's similar to using things like sufficient causes. Like Thomas Aquinas talks about there needs to be a first cause, a sufficient cause for the universe. Argument from intelligibility. If our minds are the product of material processes, they are not capable of grasping abstract truths. Yet, our minds are capable of grasping abstract truths about the universe. And this is sort of another play on a priori, but it's not about the a priori. It's about our ability to understand or comprehend the universe through the means of sort of like our presuppositions or our cognitive faculties, which can process these sort of truths that are outside of ourselves. And then the conclusion, I need to fix that. The conclusion is, therefore, our minds are not the product of purely unguided material processes. I have a whole bunch of arguments here. I kind of want to get to some of the arguments that I think are interesting about. Here's some arguments about the existence of Jesus, the veracity of his claims to be God. I think these are interesting. I'm gonna touch these briefly. If anyone wants to come in and challenge these, feel free. Or if anyone even wants to just discuss them, you don't have to be a challenger to come in to the live stream. So here's one, and now I'm forgetting where I got this argument from. I think this is another C.S. Lewis. Now that I think about it, but basically, like, it's very popular. It's the liar, lunatic, or Lord. It's the trilemma argument. Premise 1: if Jesus' claims to be God were not true, he was either A, a malicious liar, or B, mentally unstable lunatic. Premise 2: Jesus was neither a malicious liar, nor was he a mentally unstable lunatic. Therefore, conclusion: Jesus' claims to be God were true. So this is a little bit about how we can. This has to do with. It's going to be a lot of looking at exegetically Jesus' own claims and Jesus' own character as testified by the Gospels. So here's another one. The argument for the resurrection. This is a minimal facts argument. A big proponent of this argument is going to be someone like Gary Habermas. He's a famous scholar of this, developing this argument. Premise 1: if natural processes can explain minimal facts, then the supernatural resurrection is the only sufficient explanation. So minimal facts like the empty tomb, sort of like embarrassing eyewitness testimony. You have conversions of enemies or those that are highly skeptical, such as for instance, like is documented the road to Damascus, or you have Jesus' brother or a couple. Then you also have to explain sort of like the the testimony of people who are unbelievers, not just the biblical testimony. You have to explain people like Josephus. But actually, going back to the biblical testimony, it's also important to remember that the Gospels is not just one book or like a manifesto. It's many historical documents that are compiled together from different authors that are all witnesses to this event. So there's this multiple attestation of the resurrection. So yes, premise 2: natural processes cannot explain minimal facts, i.e., like hallucination, or I talked with a couple days ago. I talked with someone about the sort of like hallucinogenics or like LSD or DMT or things like that. Those cannot explain this kind of eyewitness testimony. There are a lot of other explanations which would require, for instance, like the disciples and followers of Christ afterward to be liars or to be some sort of charlatans. However, like we know in several cases documented that many of them died or were threatened with other kinds of like ill ends. If that's the case, it's not likely that they didn't believe these claims. Okay, moving on. The prophecy argument. So premise 1: if fulfilling many specific ancient messianic prophecies by chance is practically impossible unless Jesus' life resulted I said if, but it's fulfilling many specific ancient messianic prophecies by chance is practically impossible unless Jesus' life resulted from divine design. This is going to be the argument that Sam mentioned in an earlier live stream with a doctor that I believe he said it was Dr. Stoner, but basically there are so many distinct and specific prophecies for the life and the ministry and the resurrection of Jesus that the likelihood of just, I believe he said 8 of these prophecies is going to be, what is it, like filling Texas with like a foot of, I don't remember exactly, but I believe it's like a foot of marbles or something like that, and picking from one, so one out of that number. The odds are pretty incredible of just, for instance, 8 of what are like some estimates are like they're saying hundreds of prophecies in the Old Testament about the life of Jesus. And if someone has more data on that, I'd love to talk about it. I'm going to get more into this argument shortly. But the conclusion would have to follow that therefore Jesus' life resulted from divine design, not chance. Then I have a whole bunch of more arguments, but I think what I'm going to do now is I had some videos that I think would be interesting to react to about the Kalam specifically, since we've been on the Kalam. there's a YouTube channel, and this is posted 9 years ago. This is a argument against the Kalam. I have a few of these arguments against the Kalam pulled up. So one of them is, it's only 9 minutes, or 9 minutes 30 seconds. It's called the Kalam Cosmological Argument Debunked. So I will share my screen.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be?
I wouldn't say that there are only two options. It's not there is a God or the universe is eternal. That would be a false dichotomy fallacy, as there could easily be more options than that, such as our universe came into being through natural processes we don't yet understand.
One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument.
And it's an argument commonly used by religious people all over the world, so we thought it could use some debunking.
Yeah, just to start us off here. There are more options than one, God set the universe into being, or two, the universe is eternal, or some substratum of the universe is eternal. Is it really an option to say that the universe began from nothing, out of nothing, via, like he's saying, natural processes? I think that that's a really untenable view. And the main reason is going to be, well, that just begs the question. If the universe just began to exist, but there was nothing before the universe, why did it begin to exist, right? That doesn't actually explain the origin of the universe really in any way. So, like, he's trying to discredit this sort of dichotomy, but is there another option? You know, if you think about it, is there another option to this?
I'm R.
And I'm Jay.
Let's get started.
It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician.
Ugh. Notice something about that example. A rabbit exists within the universe, whereas the universe doesn't exist within itself. This is a false equivalence fallacy. Cause and effect is a law of the universe. That doesn't mean it applies to the universe as a whole. Look at this image. The universe is A. We can conclude cause and effect exist inside of A. So if the question is regarding something...
So, okay, like I've been saying sort of earlier in the stream, the premise one, that everything that begins to exist has a cause, it's not contingent upon our scientific or inferential knowledge of what's within our universe. It's not saying everything within A has this property. It's a metaphysical claim that is extended outside of the universe. For instance, everything that has sort of like a causal relationship has a beginning, because causal chains cannot be one, they cannot be infinite, they have to be finite. Because if you have an infinite causal chain, then you would have to conclude that any moment, any finite cause would have had to have already existed, because there's been an infinite time for that cause to have happened. So you land yourself in a logical contradiction that way. Then there's also the case of increasing entropy, and this is a universe that's running down, right? And you also have the ideas of sort of like this boundary theorem, where scientifically anything that's any universe that is observably expanding, and we could argue about that, but I think arguably it is expanding, then you have to conclude that it's existed for a finite amount of time. So these are all points of, for instance, law or theorem, something mathematical and abstract, or things like philosophical, metaphysical claims. So these are philosophical, mathematical, basically all a priori metaphysical claims. And to discount premise one by saying, oh, just because we see something in our universe doesn't mean that it happens outside of your universe. That's not the evidence for the argument. That's not the argument. So this is a bit of a straw man here.
Happening inside of A, then assuming cause and effect is fair. Now look at B. We don't know if cause and effect applied there, or even if it exists. Laws internal to the universe don't necessarily apply to the universe as a whole. You would have to prove that. We just don't know, as we can't observe it.
And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time?
Because we live inside the universe, not outside of it looking in.
That doesn't actually sufficiently counter the argument that the original video is making, that this video is critiquing, because we really would, like, if our universe is comprised of just the things that were created in that initial instant of creation of the universe, then there's not a whole lot of evidence to suggest even within our universe that things can be created out of nothing. And that's just a common experience within reality, right? We should actually, in fact, expect to see things sort of, if we say, one, the universe has had a moment where it sort of popped into existence, then we should conclude that things can pop into existence. We should just expect things to pop into existence. If we're going to say, well, that's not if the Big Bang is not the beginning of the universe, it's sort of like this quantum fluctuation, it's this quantum field. Well, this quantum field is very high energy. It's like a flowing stream. It's to see things popping into and out of existence within it is like waves of a stream, and it's less of any kind of ex nihilo creation. So we have to explain where did that, because it's not a sufficient cause in itself. It's not something that can exist eternally, because it's within the confines of the universe, and we observe it within our universe. So where did this quantum field, which is a state of high energy, high dynamic interaction, where did that come from?
No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise.
They only confirm your first premise in regards to things taking place inside the universe. We have no experience or scientific evidence regarding the outside of the universe.
If we have no scientific evidence or experience of things outside of our universe, i.e. things that come into existence, but were not part of the universe of things that came into existence, then we don't have good evidence to suggest that the universe could, by its own merits, come into existence. So this is actually kind of discrediting his case.
And what laws apply to the universe as a whole? Because we just can't observe it with current technology and may never be able to observe it.
If something begins to exist, it must have a cause.
Inside of the universe, perhaps, but that doesn't mean you can apply it to the universe as a whole.
Again, things beginning to exist necessitating causes, that is a metaphysical claim. It's not an inferential inductive claim or abductive claim based on scientific empirical knowledge. So this is sort of a straw man of the argument.
Come on, surely you can understand that. Okay, so now the first premise is broken, the entire argument falls apart. But just for fun, let's take a look at the rest of the argument.
So it's not a broken premise. He just doesn't understand. He doesn't understand what that what that first premise consists of. He doesn't understand the evidence for it. He also doesn't understand what it means.
What about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever.
What do you mean by typically? Because for the past decade at least,
Typically, as in like the majority of time that atheists have been around, they've said this until like what he's going to say, like the past few, maybe you could arguably like 100 years or so, but like even that's a bit dicey. So like there are still a lot of people, a lot of credible scientists, a lot of atheists who are going to say that the universe is eternal. So it's going to end up being, however you slice it, it's going to be the sort of majority of naturalist positions, especially if you're wanting to go back all the way to like the even before like Greek therapeutic philosophies and stuff like that. If you go back to like Lucretius or other sort of naturalist philosophers, like they believe in this like constantly flowing state of atoms, right? Sort of like a dance of atoms that eventually like they started colliding into each other and creating larger organizations of matter. So for the thousands of years that atheist philosophy has been around, and I mean thousands of years, it's been majority the majority view has been infinite universe. Why? Because based on the metaphysical arguments, it's really hard to say that the universe just popped into existence without any kind of explanation. There needs to be some kind of infinite thing, whether it's the universe or whether it's God, or whether it's something that's causally sufficient that isn't those two. Perhaps there is something that is, and we just haven't thought of it. But it certainly isn't the universe itself, where the universe has a beginning, but it's also the sufficient thing for its existence. That's sort of like part of the whole fallacy.
the majority of atheists would probably accept the universe began to exist in its current form via the Big Bang. One of the common points usually made is that the time did not exist prior to the universe existing in its current form, as time is a property of our current universe, so the concept of time before the universe literally makes no sense, as time as we know it only began following the Big Bang.
The universe is just there, and that's
Does time exist in the quantum vacuum? Because the quantum vacuum persists even before the Big Bang. If time doesn't exist in the quantum vacuum, then how do you see any kind of experiments of waves or particles? How do you understand how energy is operating? How do you even do science on something that is outside of the material navigability of the universe, or the material comprehension of the universe? If it's outside of the universe, how do we reach it? And then maybe that's a case that naturalism is false. So maybe in order to refute the Big Bang, you have to accept that naturalism is false. In which case, that increases the plausibility of the existence of God, if we're looking at a Bayesian analysis. So you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot if you're going to try to make this kind of argument.
all.
That seems like a quote mine. That quote was far too vague to assert Bertrand Russell that it only began following the Big Bang.
The universe is just there, and that's all.
That seems like a quote mine. That quote was far too vague to assert Bertrand Russell was claiming the universe was eternal.
But it's not a quote mine though. A quote mine is when you take something, you're basically taking something out of context, right? Removing from context is the only way to make your case. That's his little subtitle to that meme right there. But if we're illustrating a point, we don't need a whole essay from Bertrand Russell. And he did believe that the universe was infinite. And if he didn't, right, it wouldn't do anyone any services to lie about it, right? So what I would like to see is, I'd like to see him quote Bertrand Russell and see whether he thought that the universe was infinite, Or is he just going to make the accusation of quote mining? Let's take a look.
Very well may have thought that. I don't know. But either way, that quote doesn't prove
I don't know. So you accuse someone of quote mining, but you don't do the diligence to verify or maybe debunk that quote, right? So you're not looking at the context yourself. So maybe the one that's following some like logical error is the person that is not the person that is giving the quote, but it's the person that's accusing of quote mining. We have to be logically sharp, right? We can't just accuse people willy-nilly of things because we're incredulous. That's not how we build knowledge. That's not how we build systems. That's not how we understand paradigms. That's not how we go through life in our inquiries.
anything. It just shows he thinks that the universe is all that exists. It doesn't mean that it was eternal.
If the universe is all that exists, it has to be eternal. Otherwise, it is not in itself sufficient.
First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy. And that's the point.
The second law of thermodynamics is probably one of the most commonly misrepresented laws by theists, so I'll be watching where you go with this very carefully.
If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now.
The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning.
That actually wasn't that bad. Have a cookie.
This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries.
It's also something that if you're a critic of the argument, you need to deal with the second law of thermodynamics. You can't just have like this veneer of incredulousness, and then if someone reaches your personal expectations of how to handle some particular piece of evidence, be like, oh yeah, you handled that well. Now I'm not gonna deal with trying to make a rebuttal to this because I've put this framing of I'm the authority on the law of thermodynamics. Therefore, anyone who uses it wrong, I'm going to instantly discredit. Anyone who uses it right doesn't actually get to use it for their argument. That's not how this works. You have to actually deal with the second law.
In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension.
That wasn't too bad. You can have a second cookie. But it is worth noting, we can assert the universe in its current form began to exist, but we don't know anything about the singularity it came from. For example, anything outside of the current universe would no longer be...
The singularity, though, that's not outside the universe. That is part of the universe. And what we mean by the universe is all the material, all the space, all the time. So, right? If the singularity is spaceless, then it doesn't exist anywhere. If it's immaterial, then there's no parts, there's nothing for any kind of expansion to happen with. And if it's outside of time, then when is it? It's nowhere in time. So the problem is like doing this weird kind of compartmentalizing thing with the components of the beginning of the universe, the singularity.
Guaranteed to have time applying to it. So the singularity may not be eternal or finite.
So then that you're appealing to this sort of like, well, it may be like this, or it may be like that, and this sort of skeptical thinking, or this sort of like you're positing this sort of imagination of what something could be like, Well, give us some reason to think that like test your hypothesis, that build a model based on that. Don't just posit it. Otherwise, you're running into this sort of like conspiracy mindset.
Even it wouldn't have to be pinned to the concept of time.
However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time.
It's interesting that you point out how these theories have not held up against scientific scrutiny, when that same standard of scrutiny also rejects the Kalam cosmological argument.
On what grounds? Because you haven't, like he brought up Einstein's relativity and sort of like the Big Bang cosmology. He brought up the laws of thermodynamics. You totally just misunderstood the metaphysical aspects of the first premise. So on what grounds does the scientific method show that the Kalam cosmological argument fails? You have yet to demonstrate that.
More recently,
And he does nothing.
leading cosmologists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, prove that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning.
This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing.
This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning.
Well, that really depends on what you define as the beginning. We can safely say from your argument that the universe as we know it, that is one with the current laws of physics expanding from a central point, must have had a beginning.
And also the multiverse and the singularity and quantum fields, it all must have a beginning. None of it is self-sufficient. None of it is non-contingent. It's all contingent.
This, however, doesn't allow us to say anything about the universe before it began to expand. Hence, the beginning of time
Before it began to expand is not the beginning of time.
and the universe as we know it are the limits of our current understanding. We can't
That's like saying, you're basically agreeing with the Kalam. You're saying, yes, the universe had a beginning. Yes, it had a cause, but we can't say anything about it. Well, that's what the Kalam is for. It's to say something about it. It's to make a synthetical judgment. It's not just to say things analytically, like this is true, that is true. I mean, good job, but like you're not going to get anything new about that. But the Kalam, and which you have not refuted the Kalam, by the way, the Kalam requires both premises to be true, and then it builds from those premises to create something new, the conclusion, and that conclusion is that the universe had a cause. And then we ask, what would that cause be? And you can't just throw your hands up in the air and be like, oh, I don't know, it could be anything, because it has to be outside of time, it has to be outside of space, has to be immaterial, has to be powerful enough to create the universe, has to be intelligent enough to create the universe, and it has to have a lot of mind properties to ground the existence of things like moral truths, logical truths, mathematics, whether it's geometry or arithmetic, and all these a priori synthetical judgments.
can't make assertions about anything outside of this.
Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true.
Premise 1 is deeply flawed and terrible. Hence, this argument falls apart immediately, and I will be taking back.
See, okay, this is a problem. He's dismissing premise 1, but not on the grounds or based on the evidence that is supporting premise 1. So, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Can you show me a case where that's not true? Like, he really hasn't even presented a possibility where that could be not true. All he said is, oh, that's not relevant to the universe. Well, why not? Right? There's no evidence to rebut the Kalam here. Moving on.
Those cookies we gave you earlier. Whereas premise 2 kind of works so long as it only applies to the universe in its current form, though it isn't beyond the realm of
the universe began to exist is only true in the universe's current form. What does that even mean? Right? Like, if you break down what this guy's saying, he's saying, like, if you take like the existence of like my phone, right? And I say, my phone began to exist only makes sense if we think about my phone in its current form. It's like, right. That's sort of just, he's not saying anything there. He's not refuting premise true or saying, there's in no way does that make it not apply to premise one. So yeah, it's like, of course, like the universe began to exist in a particular form, but he's not refuting it, and that's not really a valid exception or anything like that. He's not making a distinction of any kind.
Possibility that the universe previously had multiple forms.
This means that the conclusion is also true.
If the universe had multiple forms, they all had to begin to exist.
The universe has a cause.
No, because cause and effect is a property internal to the universe, so you can't know it applies to the universe as a whole. But even if it is true,
Again, it's a metaphysical claim. It's not an inferential, it's not an inductive claim based on scientific inquiry.
that doesn't prove a supernatural agent is responsible.
It's supported by those.
A cause could literally mean anything, especially when we can't know
It can't mean anything. It means that something has basically sufficiently been explained by prior states.
anything about the properties of area labeled B.
And since the universe can't cause itself,
Its cause must be beyond the space-time universe.
So now we are discussing the section labeled B. I would assert we can't know anything about it with current technology, so the default position has to be, I don't know. I'm going to guess you disagree.
it must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and
And these sort of extrapolations of the Kalam, these just follow whether or not you think that there are some exceptions to how things are causally related. There's still, like, if the universe is something that is within time, within space, and is material, then the thing that creates it needs to be outside of those things. If it's inside those things, it's not a sufficient explanation for. It's a part to the whole fallacy.
unimaginably powerful.
Prove it. The properties of B could have time.
He just did. You were not listening.
B could exist within C, and it could just go on infinitely, because that could be acceptable within that plane of.
Can't. If it's within time, then we run into logical contradictions with infinite causal chains. We would expect that every single finite event has already occurred because it's had infinite amount of time to occur.
existence. I'm not saying it does, but I am saying you can't assert anything about it without first making observations.
Much like
And the Kalam is using observations to make a conclusion.
God.
What? I have so many problems with this reasoning, but I'll give you a chance to clarify it.
The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
Okay, so you don't clarify it at all. You just float it there like a turd on the current.
The original author of that original video that they're critiquing from the Reasonable Faith team, right? They listed out some attributes: spaceless, timeless, immaterial. Sort of, it's like it's sufficient, whether it's sufficient intellectually, within its agency, within its power, whether it's things like personal, it's moral. All of these things need to exist to explain the origin of things that are contingent within our own universe, right? So if we look at all these properties, can we conclude that anything other than God matches this description? Like, it's kind of like, I almost get the feeling that he's not listening to the argument.
Okay, cool. It fits a definition you made. So what? Consider this.
So God exists?
You look at a boulder on top of a mountain and ask me where it came from. I say Bloop did it. You ask me to prove it, and I say Bloop is defined as an immaterial force that moves boulders up mountains. The boulder is up there, hence it fits the definition of Bloop, and now it is reasonable to believe Bloop exists. Would you accept it? No.
That is a state of semantics, right? So if we're gonna say, well, the properties of spacelessness, timelessness, immateriality, etc., well, you can just call that the spaghetti monster, right? That's fine. You can call it the spaghetti monster, but what we're actually meaning is these properties, which basically are the equivalent properties of, like, the omni properties of the God of the Old and New Testament, the Christian God, the Jewish God, the Islamic God. It's the God with the omni properties. Then the sort of like classical theistic God, right? So if you want to call the classical theistic God the spaghetti monster, that's fine, but that doesn't refute the argument. That doesn't show that the classical theistic God doesn't exist because you called it something. You can call the classical theistic God whatever you want. You could call it a water bottle, right? So in like manner, you can say this Bloop or whatever he says is the sufficient cause for the origin of that boulder being positioned where it is. That's just a semantic game, and that's not actually a valid argument against the conclusions, the extrapolations of the Kalam.
Because it isn't sufficient evidence to prove something exists. Anyone can just make up definitions for things to fit reality.
Right, and that's the whole premise of language, is making up definitions of things to fit reality. Where there isn't a single word in any dictionary that isn't contingent on a mind. All of them are contingent on a mind, and that doesn't mean that definitions or meanings of things are subjective. But what it means is that the way that we describe things in the world is completely subjective of our way of interpreting and expressing our perceptions of the world. So we have the thoughts, we have the mental constructs, right? And then we look for the tools, the words, and if we don't have a tool, sometimes we do make up a new word, and then we sort of like we send it off in a sort of material substratum that reaches someone else, whether it's writing or speaking or another form of communication. And then they receive it, and if they have that word in their lexicon, then they'll be able to perceive your meaning. They'll be able to take your meaning. If they don't have that word, they can't, right? And so what happens if someone doesn't have a word for something that's a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, all-powerful, all-knowing, moral, intelligent being? If someone doesn't have a word for that, I mean, it's very hard to say all those things in repetition ad infinitum. You have to figure out, because words are basically they're putting together concepts, they're putting together ideas for us so that we can communicate them easier. We can call it God. There's nothing wrong with calling that God. That is essentially what any natural theist, any classical theist believes. That's basically that's how, in many ways, that's how the God of the Bible describes himself. That's how that's usually standard fare for any kind of theist. Those are the attributes that are essential. So to play this sort of semantic game, it's not a valid criticism. And in fact, he's kind of demonstrating that words require a mind. Like before you have the words, you need the mind. And that's actually backing up the argument for one, intelligibility, and also intelligent design.
Doesn't mean it is reasonable to believe they exist because of that. It amazes me that this argument is so common.
Right, something doesn't exist because you defined it as something, right? then that proposition exists in the ether. Does that thing exist, right? If you say proposition T, a floating teacup in space, that now has been defined, but the question of whether it exists is a different story. But what the Kalam has done is it's shown that the definition of the thing that we're looking for does exist. And we say, that thing is God. Then the response can't be, well, you just defined it as God, because we were looking for the properties. We weren't looking for it to be called God. We were looking for the properties of that entity that needs all these attributes, right? It needs all these extended modes of existence.
And given the huge flaws in its reasoning. But that's enough of that, I think. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for weekly videos, like this video, and share it around to help us raise the bar of public discourse.
Yes, this is okay. So this is called The Rational Channel. This video was published 9 years ago, to be fair. I suggest that you give it a watch, give it a like. And I'm going to be wrapping up this live stream. Thanks everyone for watching. Unless someone comes up in literally the next 10 seconds, I'm going to be ending the stream. So I appreciate you guys. Happy belated Christmas, happy holidays. God bless everyone. So bye. I'll see you.